Okay, so in this video lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the more bizarre or irrational occurrences that happen to Pi while he is aboard the lifeboat. So there are some situations or events in the novel that really make us question the reliability of our narrator, in this case, of Pi. So while you're reading the narrative, certain things he's going to say start to sound, made up, basically. Like, there's no way a rational person would believe that some of these events actually happened to a person. So there's aspects of Pi's narrative that make us question whether or not he's fully telling us the truth. So this is what we would call a kind of unreliable narrator. That means, he's unreliable. We can't completely trust or believe everything that our narrator is telling us. There could be maybe gaps in the story, or they're stretching the truth, or they're adding in, things that didn't happen. But Pi's narrative is really going to challenge us as readers to start, thinking about, why is he telling this story? Are these, he clearly believes this happened, but do we believe that this really happened? There's a lot of doubt and speculation about, especially in the sort of second half of the narrative, where events just get weirder and weirder, basically. So he'll talk about events that really stretch our capability to, or suspend our beliefs, I guess, to sort of think about, whether we really trust Pi's narration of events or not. So certain things already that have maybe tested the limits of our readers in regards to whether or not we trust Pi's narrative 100% or not. The first one would just be, the fact that he was able to train a tiger at all seems pretty far-fetched. So he is talking about surviving 227 days aboard a life raft with a Bengal tiger. Even that scenario itself is so bizarre, right? Completely out of the realm of ever imagining something like that would happen to a person in reality. But Pi's, asking us to follow his narrative and, follow his train of thought, or follow his story, and believe what he's telling us is true. So we do that as readers. But there are things that, it doesn't make sense to, a lot of people who read it when you come across weirder and weirder events. So eventually there'll be moments where Pi's sanity, we start to question that. Or whether or not he's seeing or remembering things clearly anymore. Or whether the events are just the figments of his imagination that he, created or thought about or dreamed about during his long experience of being lost at sea. So what's so amazing or miraculous or bizarre or rational about training a tiger? Well, there are sort of it is a man-eating tiger. A Bengal tiger is 450 pounds, a wild animal. So it could be believable enough if you think about it as a zoo animal. It's not a wild, it's been sort of partially domesticated, or it's used to being in an enclosed environment with a trainer, or not a trainer, but a zookeeper. And then Pi just takes on that role as zookeeper. So it's not completely that bizarre to believe that part of it. But he does, convey the fact that he had Richard Parker completely trained at certain points, even jumping through hoops. So it starts to sort of stretch our ability to believe everything. And then Pi's, he talks about having the turtle shell as a shield, and just the whole thing starts becoming more and more, um, unbelievable as events go on. And then all of these strange occurrences also coincide with kind of the breakdown of Pi's physical well-being. So the longer he is aboard the ship, the more physically deterioration is occurring in his body. His mind and his health are deteriorating quickly without proper food and water and nutrition, or sleep even. So he kind of is starting to fall apart, and he acknowledges that death, at times, death was approaching. He thought he was going to die. And, in those moments of weakness, he does talk about, having almost like figments or dreams that he couldn't tell whether it was real or not. So some of those occurrences that we read about in the latter half of the novel that are so bizarre. There's one chapter where Pi believes he's talking directly to Richard Parker, and we'll talk a little bit more about that part. There's the coincidence of running into another man who's lost at sea, a blind French man. Very strange that two castaways or two people lost at sea would run into each other, both alone on the Pacific Ocean. So, is that a coincidence, or what is that significant, that relationship that forms between Pi and this blind French man? And then finally, Pi will come across a bizarre island that on the surface seems almost like an ideal utopia with fresh water and enough food for both he and Richard Parker. But it becomes kind of an illusion, and he needs to leave the island. But we'll talk more about those incidents in our ongoing lectures. I do want to talk a little bit about Richard Parker's presence, and how both Pi and Richard Parker are suffering greatly in the latter half of the story. So in chapters 80 and 81, Pi pretty much acknowledges that, without Richard Parker, he wouldn't be alive, or he wouldn't have survived. So the presence of Richard Parker does determine whether Pi lives or dies in this experience. And he acknowledges as much when he's talking, or he acknowledges that his story is hard to believe. And that's what he says on page 80, or on page 247. He says, "I know my survival is hard to believe. When I think back, I can hardly believe it myself. My crude exploitation of Richard Parker's weak sea legs is not the only explanation. There is another. I was the source of food and water." So he kind of is rationalizing, or giving us some more rational explanations for how this might be true. So he says on page 248, "I brought him food and I brought him fresh water. My agency was pure and miraculous. It conferred power upon me. Proof I remained alive day after day, week after week. Proof he did not attack me, even when I was asleep on the tarpaulin. Proof I am here to tell you this story." So we might not believe that Pi could train Richard Parker, or even assert dominance over him, or have him trained at all. But there was, in chapter 80, he does convey how he has Richard Parker trained at this point, such that Richard Parker waits to be fed by Pi, and doesn't attack him when Pi has the fish in his hands. And Pi is able to assert his authority and his dominance over Richard Parker. So he describes this battle. He says, "For 2, perhaps 3 seconds, a terrific battle of minds for status and authority was waged between a boy and a tiger. and it's Pi who wins, and Richard Parker who becomes the sort of subservient or more passive part of this relationship, and who allows Pi to come aboard the lifeboat once the raft has been destroyed. So Pi's trying to sort of rationalize events that seem completely bizarre and unreal, but it's his explanation makes it seem, possible even that a zoo animal like even a tiger could become tame enough for them to share this lifeboat together for that many days. Unbelievable, but not completely outside the realm of our rational minds. So it's he'll keep going with these sort of weird events, and each one sort of seems more unbelievable than the next one. But training Richard Parker, it does seem possible. So one rationalized explanation of why Pi might be sort of remembering all these strange occurrences could be partially due to the fact that in his kind of deprived state, his body, his mind are kind of breaking down the longer he is lost at sea. So he's sleeping a lot more. He's has sort of, no, his nutrients are low. So he's not eating, he's not drinking enough water. So he's almost in this kind of half sleep, half awake dream state. And we can sort of understand possibly, well, how some of the things he sees or experiences at this time could just be figments of his imagination. The dreams of somebody who might be lost at sea, or figments of their imagination, or mirages, illusions. And he kind of acknowledges that he was sort of thinking irrationally at times during this period, because he talks about this dream rag that he sometimes puts on his face to fall asleep. So chapter 87 describes how he used this dream rag almost like a form of escape, a mental kind of escape or imaginary type of escape, where he was able to place himself in, just escape the reality that was around him. So he says, one of my favorite methods of escape was what amounts to a gentle asphyxiation. I used a piece of cloth that I cut from the remnants of a blanket. I call it my dream rag. I wet it with seawater so that it was soaking but not dripping. I lay comfortably on the tarpaulin and I placed the dream rag on my face, fitting it to my features. I would fall into a daze, not difficult for someone in such an advanced state of lethargy to begin with. But the dream rag gave a special quality to my daze. It must have been the way it restricted my air intake. I would be visited by the most extraordinary dreams, trances, visions, thoughts, sensations, remembrances, and time would be gobbled up. So it's a way to pass time and a way to sort of escape from some of the harsh realities of this struggle. But it's also kind of could be an explanation, a more rational explanation for why he remembers such weird, bizarre things happening. Perhaps they're parts of his dreams when he was aboard this life raft. So one possibility. You might be more, willing to stretch your imagination and believe that what happens to Pi is exactly what he says happens to Pi. But there are some, other explanations or reasoning why he might be having such bizarre memories of this time. So the progression of Pi's deterioration of mind and body, it keeps getting worse. Both he and Richard Parker are suffering greatly, and in fact they both go blind. So based on lack of nutrients or something in the water, the salt. Both of them end up losing their vision, and it becomes, it's almost like the last moments of their lives, or they believe they're soon to die. And this is the breakdown of their bodies. Their physical strength has dwindled, and they're basically skin and bones. Um, Pi feels like he's failed Richard Parker, that he's on his, last legs, that both are going to die imminently, so in the near future. But almost on his deathbed, he hears a voice. So this is one of the kind of bizarre, strange moments in the text where he believes that Richard Parker is talking to him. So even Pi, maybe in his weird, sort of delusional, near-death state, he hears words. So he says, "Is someone there?" And he concludes that he's gone mad, or that this is, a figment of his imagination. But he keeps talking to this figment of his imagination, and they start talking about food. So they dream, they talk about their food, wishes, things they would love to eat. Pi, is thinking about all of the delicious vegetarian dishes that he wishes he would have in this moment. So it's, a whole banquet of delicious, mixed vegetable dishes and all these different types of curries. And, he's just allowing his imagination to sort of soar with all the different foods that he would like. And then this other voice sort of chimes in about what they would want to eat. And interestingly, it's all really kind of meat-heavy dishes, right? So, and it's all a lot of organs, like the entrails of an animal. So you have beef tongue, tripe, like the intestines, sweetbreads, which are organs, and then brains even, sausage, kidneys. So it's a lot of like the entrails or the offal meats that this other voice is talking about. So this is one clue that Pi starts thinking, well, this person might be, this voice anyway, is a carnivore. This is definitely a meat eater. And it kind of disgusts Pi. He thinks of it as disgusting, sacrilegious, and it grosses him out to even have to consider eating that kind of meat dishes. So he kind of clues in, and he starts thinking. So he says, a sudden understanding dawned on me. So he starts asking the voice, would you eat bleeding raw beef? Would you eat congealed blood of a dead pig? Would you eat anything from an animal, the last remains? And then he asks, would you eat a plain carrot? And then the voice answers no to that one. So clearly we're dealing with a carnivore who Pi is sort of addressing in the scene. And then he laughs. He thinks he hasn't gone mad, that he is in fact talking to Richard Parker. So this carnivore that he's discussing, having this conversation with food with, he decides it's Richard Parker, who is a carnivore, and he thinks he's actually talking to his tiger friend. So he says, I wasn't hearing voices, I hadn't gone mad. It was Richard Parker who was speaking to me, the carnivorous rascal. So this is one of those cases where the line between man and animal is being blurred, very directly. So first we have the anthropomorphism of imagining an animal talking. So we have that kind of anthropomorphized animal. But then it starts becoming more clear that he's not talking to Richard Parker at all, that this is another voice from somebody different. So it becomes more clear. He starts talking about ever killing somebody with this voice. because he wants to understand if Richard Parker is a skilled hunter, and he's curious. So they do talk about whether they've killed, or whether Richard Parker has killed anyone, and the voice answers two people, a man and a woman. And then the voice acknowledges that they did not taste good, but it was out of need. So they killed this person, or this voice, Richard Parker. At this time, Pi believes it's Richard Parker, has confessed to killing two people based on a need to kill them. So they explain that on page 274, where it says, it was them or me. That is need expressed in all its amoral simplicity, but any regrets now? It was the doing of a moment. It was circumstance. Instinct. It's called instinct. Still, answer the question. Any regrets now? I don't think about it. The very definition of an animal. That's all you are. And what are you? A human being, I'll have you know. So right there we have another indication that Pi's not talking to Richard Parker at all. He's talking to a human being. And in fact, this human being has just confessed to killing two other people. And also tasting them. Cannibalism. So we have another kind of blurring between the lines of animals and human in that instance, where it becomes apparent that this other voice is actually a human who has committed murder and cannibalized the bodies. And Pi is mistaking this person for an animal. And then it dawns on Pi that it couldn't be Richard Parker who he's talking to because of the accent. So there's a distinct French accent in the voice in this conversation. So he decides that, okay, well, this couldn't be Richard Parker because Richard Parker would never have a French accent. So Pi welcomes this fellow survivor aboard the boat. And first they're very joyous. They have found a human companion. You know, what are the odds? Two blind castaways or survivors finding each other in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So they both are blind. They both are in their own sort of boats, and they've run across each other in the middle of the Pacific. So completely bizarre and unbelievable on the surface. And then they are still talking about food and trying to assess what the other has aboard their boat. The blind Frenchman confesses to having eaten, cigarettes and a boot, pretty much anything that is remotely edible, he will eat it. And then Pi thinks that he is going to welcome this new friend aboard his lifeboat, but almost immediately this fellow survivor attacks Pi, lands on him heavily. So this is on page 282. He landed on me heavily. We fell half onto the tarpaulin, half onto the middle bench. His hands reached for my throat. Brother, I grasped through his overeager embrace. My heart is with you, but I must urgently suggest we repair to another part of my humble ship. You're damn right your heart is with me, he said, and your liver and your flesh. So it becomes immediately apparent to us that this, assumedly friendly survivor, he's actually not that friendly, and he's after Pi. So he's assaulting him, and he wants to, in fact, cannibalize his body, kill him, and eat him. But the only thing saving Pi in this, battle for his life is the fact that Richard Parker is aboard the boat still. So the ending of The Blind Frenchman is Richard Parker killing and eating his body. So at the end of chapter 90, I tried to hold him back. Alas, It was too late. Before I could say the word alone, I was alone again. I heard the mirror's clicking of claws against the bottom of the boat. No more than the sound of a pair of spectacles falling to the floor, and the next moment my dear brother shrieked in my face like I've never heard a man shriek before. He let go of me. This was the terrible cost of Richard Parker. He gave me a life, my own, but at the expense of taking one. He ripped the flesh off the man's frame and cracked his bones. The smell of blood filled my nose. Something in me died then that has never come back to life. So, this, friendship that could have been ends up in bloodshed, with Richard Parker killing the blind Frenchman who attacked Pi. So it's the terrible cost of Richard Parker is the fact that he saves Pi's life, but at the expense of taking this other person's life. So it's another moment that represents a kind of loss of innocence for Pi, in the fact that he says, something in me died that has never come back to life. So there's a part of him that has been lost in this event, even though it's bizarre and, irrational to think about what is actually occurring. Something has been lost in Pi's innocence, and he's never been the same since. And Pi even acknowledges to, even trying his own cannibalism on the man's body. So after Richard Parker has killed him, Pi uses the man's torso for bait, or uses his flesh for bait. So he is going to fish with human flesh. And then he also admits to actually taking a little bite of a dried piece of human flesh. So even Pi is not, he can't avoid, blurring that line between animal and human. So just like the French or blind Frenchman who gave in to that desperate need to survive by resorting to the basest form of survival, savage cannibalism, Pi also confesses to even trying cannibalism in his desperate hours. So cannibalism, it happens, I guess, in survival scenarios. I'm sure you guys have heard of stories where, people in airplanes crash in the remote mountains, and in order to survive, they begin to eat each other, or start eating the bodies of the dead or the wounded. So it's happened. It's gross, but it's a survivor horror story, to have to, admit that, even humans who we believe are civilized could stoop to the level of animal and, become cannibalistic in that desperation. So something interesting to think about.